Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime. Crue Trime. Crue Trime. If you are new here, hello. My name is Sarah, and what I do here is tell you a terrible story to ruin your day and put on my makeup at the same time. So if you're into crime, chaos, and concealer, then you are in the right place. So make sure that you subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications so that way you will never miss one of my terrible stories. We have entered the season of like thunder and lightning storms every day. So it's storming outside. So the lights might go out. We don't know. Today's story is one that I had not heard of this particular person, but the ending is actually pretty familiar from another story, but we'll get to that part. This is the story of Bobby Joe Long. Bobby Joe Long was born on October 14th, 1953 in Canova, West Virginia, to Joe and Louetta Long. Bobby's father dipped out of the picture early, so it left Louetta to raise Bobby as a single parent. And raise him, she did, with a cocktail of codependency, dysfunction, and what we will politely call boundary annihilation. Louetta and Bobby were close, like too close. By multiple accounts, they actually slept in the same bed together until Bobby was well into his teenage years.
Don't like that.
To be fair, though, they were living in and out of motels during some pretty hard times, and Bobby resented how frequently Louetta would bring strange men into their lives. Now, Bobby didn't have any siblings, which made this warped dynamic even more suffocating. This was like Bates Motel minus taxidermy. Growing up, Bobby was relentlessly bullied, and not just because of his family situation, but because he was also born with Klinefelter syndrome, which is a genetic condition where the male has an extra X chromosome. So instead of XY, they have XXY. And this causes hormonal imbalances that leads to gynecomastia, which is breast development. And remember, this is middle of nowhere, West Virginia in the 1960s, where masculinity was king and anything even slightly off was like, you became a walking bullseye. Now, Bobby's classmates didn't need to know the medical details. His body was different, and that was enough. So he was teased, mocked, and bullied. They called him names. They pulled at his shirt. They laughed when he changed his clothes in the locker room.
Heavy naturals.
And this psychological damage was not subtle. It was a full-on demolition job. We all know that teenage boys are not known for their emotional maturity or sensitivity.
I flip my boner up into my waistband. It hides it and it feels awesome.
But the psychological fallout from this bullying was massive. Now, Bobby reportedly underwent surgery as a teenager to remove this breast tissue, but the scars, emotional and physical, never healed. And this teasing ignited like a rage. And this is where it gets really dark, because instead of blaming the bullies, the ones that were actually tormenting him, Bobby started blaming girls, women, femininity itself. Basically, he associated this shame, this humiliation, this trauma with the thing that made him different. And in his mind, it was his feminized body that was a curse, and the curse came from women. Well, Bobby's family eventually relocated to Florida. He spent much of his adolescence in Miami and later in like the Fort Lauderdale area. By all accounts, Bobby did not thrive in school. He was like average intelligence, but he had no interest in academics. He was known to be aggressive, moody, and isolated. And to add a little bit more spice in the mix, he had actually suffered multiple head injuries over the years, like from bicycle crashes, sports, general childhood chaos. The point is, his frontal lobe was basically like a trauma piñata. Bobby attended Hialeah High School in suburban Miami, but he dropped out in the 10th grade. So instead of diplomas and prom dates, Bobby focused on motorcycles and feeding a growing grudge against the world. Now, despite all this, Bobby somehow landed a wife. In 1974, he actually married his high school girlfriend, Cynthia DeLong, when he was about 20 years old. Now, you're probably thinking, hold up, if Bobby Long hated women so much, how did he even land a high school girlfriend, let alone get married? and have kids. I mean, was this like the world's most elaborate keep your enemies close type of a strategy? Not exactly. So the thing about men who hate women is that they still want women obsessively, desperately. They essentially crave what they also resent, which is connection, validation, sex, control. You know, the misogyny doesn't cancel out the desire, it just twists it up. So yeah, Bobby had met Cynthia DeLong when they were teenagers, both attending Hialeah High School in South Florida, and on the surface, they looked like your average young couple. But behind the scenes, Cynthia was more of a possession than a partner. She was the duct tape holding together this fragile ego, proof to the world and to himself that he wasn't the freak that the bullies said he was. Bobby did not love Cynthia in a healthy way. Surprise. They had 2 children, they had settled into suburban life in South Florida, but domestic bliss was not on the menu. Cynthia would later say that Bobby was volatile, emotionally unpredictable. He'd rage out over small things and then apologize, like profusely, pathetically, you know what I mean? Like very Lifetime movie vibes. He didn't trust her, he didn't respect her, but he wanted to own her. Now, once Cynthia had enough of this bullshit and stopped playing the role that he had assigned to her, once she stood up for herself and walked away, this wasn't just a divorce, this was a betrayal. Treason. And this is when his rage really boiled over. So, when Cynthia actually left him in 1980, she took their 2 children with her, and Bobby didn't grieve like a normal person. He didn't seek therapy or try to become a better person. No, he went full villain origin story. Woo! He doubled down on this hatred, and he started rehearsing violence in his head. And then he started acting on it. After the divorce, Bobby bounced between jobs. He worked as an X-ray tech, but couldn't seem to keep steady employment. He just spent a lot of time alone, brewing, stewing, fantasizing. So his neighbors would describe him as quiet and kind of weird and, kind of looking for a fight. And at some point during this time, the switch flipped. Bobby didn't care anymore about seeking relationships, he just wanted control, and he figured out a disturbingly effective way to get it. Classified ads. Okay, so for the youngs that are watching this and they have no idea what the F classified ads are, this is like pre-Craigslist, pre-Facebook Marketplace. If you wanted to sell some old furniture or like a treadmill that you only ever used to hang up laundry, you would put a blurb about it in your local newspaper. And that's where Bobby would start to find these women, alone, selling household items. So he'd call the number, pretend to be interested in buying the item, arrange a time to come over to pick it up, and then he would attack the women. Now, Bobby wasn't there to rob the women. He didn't steal anything. He wasn't taking the couch or the lamp or the whatever it was. He just wanted to exert control. And these would be very violent, methodical sexual assaults. He would often bind and gag the women, sometimes at knife point, and then he would rape them right there in their own homes. No ransom note, no murder, just, an attack and this haunting feeling that nobody would ever believe them. And, tragically, many times, nobody did. So, from 1981 to 1983, Bobby Joe Long was answering classified ads and then raping women at the rate of nearly 1 a month. And these are just the ones we know about. The true number will never be known. So Bobby Joe Long would answer these ads using some kind of fake name, schedule a visit, and then he would show up clean cut and polite. And remember, this is the early 80s. There's no caller ID. When you got a phone call on your house phone, you didn't know who was on the other line until you answered the call. And then there would really be no record of who made that call until way later when you got your phone bill. And most of these attacks followed a very chilling pattern. So he would brandish a knife or pretend to have a gun, and then he would tie the women up, with items found in their own home, phone cords, scarves, belts. He'd gag them using their own underwear or socks, and then he would rape them multiple times, sometimes over hours, and then he would just vanish. And the police in these situations were pretty useless. So the victims that reported these crimes were often met with skepticism. Most officers didn't believe them. Others would claim that lack of fingerprints or a struggle meant that the sex must have been consensual. And some departments just simply didn't care, especially if the woman was like a single person, a sex worker, or like, God forbid, somebody with mental health issues. Back then, running after serial rapists was just like not a high priority. If it wasn't a murder, it wasn't a manhunt. And because even though women were being brutalized in their own homes, the system failed to see a pattern or to care enough to connect the dots.
Your tone seems very pointed right now.
So, Bobby Joe Long slipped through the cracks again and again and again. But his behavior was starting to escalate. He started spending more time stalking victims. He would cut their phone lines before entering their homes. He even began bringing restraints with him, no longer improvising with phone cords and belts. He was planning these attacks in advance. He even started to experiment with strangulation, though at this point he would stop short of killing them. But it was only a matter of time. By late 1983, the assaults weren't giving him the same rush. He was looking for a bigger buzz. And in early 1984, after hundreds of miles, dozens of victims, and years of getting away with it, Bobby Joe Long packed it up and moved to Tampa. So in the spring of 1984, Bobby Joe Long had officially arrived in the Tampa Bay area, and he was done with foreplay. After years and years of attacking women using his very clever classified ad system, he was now ready to kill. And he had a plan. His targets were almost always very young women. Many of them were sex workers, dancers, or hitchhikers, people that the public wouldn't care about. People the police barely bothered to investigate when they went missing. And Bobby knew it. So he would cruise around the Tampa, St. Pete area in his red Dodge Magnum, just scouting around for vulnerable women. And once he found one, he'd offer them a ride, or in some cases, force them into his car. Then he would drive them to a secluded area that he had previously scouted out. Then he would bind, rape, and murder them, usually by strangulation. Then he would dump their bodies into isolated areas, a ditch, a construction zone, you get it. So here's a pretty quick rundown of how the murders unfolded. This quick rundown's not so quick, because there's a lot of them. 20-year-old Ann Wick was last seen near Tampa on May 13th, 1984. Her body was later found off of a remote logging road in Pasco County. She had been raped, bound with rope, and strangled. Her remains were found posed, like legs spread open, hands tied, like he wanted to humiliate her, even in death. Now, this was Bobby's first kill, and it showed a level of planning that screamed, not an impulse. On May 27th, 1984, a former beauty pageant contestant turned dancer, 22-year-old Michelle Denise Sims, was picked up in Tampa and then later found near Plant City off of I-4. She had been sexually assaulted, bound, and bludgeoned. Bobby left her near a power pole, posed like a warning to anyone who might get close. Now, the next case kind of threw the police off a little bit. 22-year-old Elizabeth Loudenbach was not a sex worker. She was a factory worker who had vanished while walking home on June 8th, 1984. She was quiet, kind of bookish, and she lived with her parents. But her decomposed body was found in a field weeks later in Brandon, Florida, with her hands tied behind her back. Now, Bobby would later say that he didn't mean to kill her, which is rich, considering that she was raped and strangled. Now, this murder confirmed what investigators feared. This guy didn't have, a type. He wasn't just targeting sex workers. This was an equal opportunity predator. A waitress at the Texas Steer restaurant in Tampa, 21-year-old Vicki Marie Elliott, disappeared after her shift in July of that year. Her body was found in a wooded area off of a dirt road with signs of sexual assault and strangulation. Bobby had begun escalating again. Now there was less time between these kills, less hesitation, more confidence. A couple months later, 18-year-old Chanel Devon Williams was found strangled and nude in a Tampa orange grove. She had been missing for days. Her murder was especially brutal, and her body had been left in the sun. to decompose. At this point, the Tampa Police Department was scrambling, but they had no idea they were chasing a man that had already raped dozens of women across the state under their noses. 28-year-old Karen Dinsfriend was a fast food worker and aspiring model. She vanished on September 30th while waiting for a bus in Tampa. Her decomposed body was found weeks later west of town. Her cause of death was consistent with the others, sexual assault, ligature strangulation, and then body dumped in a remote location. In early October, 22-year-old Kimberly Kyle Hops was reported missing by her roommate. Her body was found on a construction site, and like the others, she had been raped, bound, and strangled, and then discarded like trash. 18-year-old Virginia Lee Johnson's body was found near Hillsborough County, bound and strangled in November of that year. The positioning, the rope, the method, unmistakable. This was one killer, and he was not slowing down. By November of 1984, Bobby Joe Long had raped more than 50 women, and he had murdered at least 10 in less than a year. Tampa was in full panic mode. The media dubbed him everything from the classified ad rapist to the Tampa Bay serial killer, and law enforcement still had no idea who he was. There were no fingerprints, there's no surveillance footage. This is the 80s, that's not a thing that happened, and DNA testing was prehistoric. But on November 3rd, 1984, Bobby Joe Long picked the wrong girl. On November 3rd, 1984, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh was leaving her job at Krispy Kreme Donuts in Tampa when Bobby Joe Long snatched her right off her bike at gunpoint. He blindfolded her, bound her, and kept her captive in his apartment for 26 hours. He assaulted her repeatedly, but Lisa, from the moment she was taken, her brain went into overdrive. Now, it is important to understand a little bit more about Lisa. Her home life wasn't great. Lisa was actually living with her grandmother and her grandma's boyfriend in Tampa, Florida, in a home that, to put it mildly, was not safe. What should have been a place of stability and protection had turned into a nightmare. Lisa was enduring ongoing abuse, manipulation, and emotional neglect behind closed doors, day in and day out. Now, she had dropped hints to the adults in her life, like teachers and neighbors, but nobody stepped in. Nobody was listening closely enough. Lisa had actually reached a point where she felt really hopeless, trapped, and she'd made a plan. After her shift that day at Krispy Kreme, she was going to go home and take her own life. In her own words, she just wanted the pain to stop. But when she walked out of the donut shop on November 3rd, 1984, fate had other plans for her. So, she had been snatched off the street by this creep, and Lisa already knew fear and trauma. But more than anything, she knew how to survive. So now, faced with this stranger whose intentions were clearly dangerous, Lisa chose strategy over panic. Okay, so I'm leaving out the very specific details of what Bobby did to her, but it's all the things that you would imagine. But Lisa knew that if she was going to get out of there, she had to be smart. She kept it calm. She didn't get hysterical. She didn't beg. She didn't fight. Instead, she humanized herself. She told some stories, some true, some made up, to make him see her as a person, not an object. She told him that her name was Carla, she made up this fake name, but then she also mentioned that she had a sick relative at home that needed her, somebody that would miss her if she didn't come home. She positioned herself in his eyes as somebody whose disappearance would be noticed, questioned, and investigated. Meanwhile, she was memorizing everything. The sound of the train in the distance, the fabric of the seat underneath her, the smell of the room, the distance between the rooms and the hallways. Even when blindfolded, Lisa used all of her senses like a detective. And she left fingerprints intentionally wherever she could, knowing that it would help the police later. She studied her captor. She watched how he moved. She listened to what he said. She took note of every detail that she could safely gather. She talked to Bobby like they could be a couple. You know what I mean? So after 26 hours of physical, psychological, and emotional torment, Bobby Joe Long did something that he'd never done before. He let her go. He drove Lisa to an area near a church in Tampa, and then he told her to wait a few minutes before removing the blindfold so he could drive away. Lisa did not wait. As soon as she heard those tires peel away, she snatched off that blindfold. She ran to safety and call the police immediately. And she didn't just tell the police what happened to her, she told them every little detail about who did it. So Lisa sat down with these investigators, and despite the trauma she just endured, she gave a full, detailed description of everything. She described his car, a red Dodge Magnum, the layout of his apartment, the general area where she believed it was located, sounds, smells, furniture, even phrases that he used often. She remembered everything, every sensory clue, every strategic breadcrumb. This case really reminds me of another one that we covered in the past. I'll link it up here and I'll link it in the description box, where a girl very similarly found herself in this situation. She was snatched right out of her own front yard, but she memorized everything. Magnet on the fridge, all of that stuff is what took that guy down. So the police used her description to track down this red Dodge Magnum. Now they found the car registered to Bobby Joe Long, and surprise, surprise, he had a criminal record. On November 16th, 1984, Bobby Joe Long was arrested outside a movie theater in Tampa, Florida. Police found damning evidence in his car and apartment linking him to multiple unsolved murders, but the cornerstone of the case was the girl who lived.
Task Force detectives say they have such a strong case against Long that even if they didn't have Long's statements, even if Lisa Rhodes had not escaped to tell her story, fiber evidence and items taken from Long's apartment would have been enough to charge him with all 9 murders. Said one detective, he didn't have to tell us a thing. Yet police acknowledge there could have been more murders if the pieces had not come so quickly together in those frantic 30 hours before Long's arrest.
Lisa McVeigh wasn't just a survivor, she was the key witness, and the reason one of Florida's most prolific serial killers was finally stopped. After his arrest, Bobby Joe Long confessed to those 10 murders in detail, but authorities suspected he probably killed more. In several cases, he gave details that only the killer would know, positions of the bodies, clothing, binding materials. One investigator later described him speaking of these crimes like he was describing a sandwich. It was all there, no remorse, no emotion, just a cold inventory of horror.
A lot of lives just gone right down the tubes because of me, in one way or another. And it's not a good feeling. It's not a pleasant feeling. I'm not proud of anything I've done. And the worst thing is, I don't understand why. I don't understand why.
The trial was a media frenzy. Lisa McVeigh took the stand and testified against him. Her story was captivating, and her bravery directly ended a serial killer's reign of terror. With so much evidence and a mountain of confessions, prosecutors didn't need to try all 10 of the murder cases. Instead, they focused on the murder of Michelle Sims, the 22-year-old former beauty queen whose body was found near Plant City in May 1984. Why that particular case? Well, it was because the forensic evidence was rock solid. Fibers from Bobby's car matched the blanket that Michelle's body was wrapped in. Hair samples from the victim were found in his trunk, and trace evidence tied her directly to him. It was really like the perfect case for the death penalty, and Florida was ready to oblige. But the justice system wasn't done with him just yet. In addition to the death sentence, Long also received 28 life sentences for the murders and rapes that he pled guilty to. He was sentenced to 99 years for Lisa McVeigh's kidnapping, and additional concurrent sentences for sexual battery and armed assault. In total, the man was legally buried under multiple centuries of punishment. It was a rare moment where the system actually got things right. Largely thanks to the bravery of a teenage girl.
And that's on period. Bye-bye!
Bobby Joe Long was sent to Florida State Prison in Rayford, where he sat on death row for over 3 decades, a far longer life than he ever gave to his victims. On May 23rd, 2019, after exhausting his appeals and watching the world slowly forget about him, Bobby Joe Long ate his last meal, roast beef, bacon, fries, and soda, before he was executed by lethal injection. He declined to make a final statement, no apology, no acknowledgement of guilt, no last-minute attempt to explain himself. He was 65 years old. And sitting in the front row of the gallery at the execution chamber that day, Lisa McVeigh. And by the way, she's now a sheriff's deputy in Hillsborough County, and she uses her past to protect others, which is total badass energy. And that is the story of Bobby Joe Long. Well, that was sufficiently terrible, but Aren't they all? If you're curious to know what makeup I used in today's look down in the description box because everything is linked. And also down there is the link to a Google Doc. So if you want to recommend a Crue Trime story to me, you can click on it, fill in all the dirty details. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! Thank you so much for watching today and for wait, what? This vision is not coming together. Din's friend. Wow. Groves, tap. I don't know how I feel about this makeup today. They're not all winners, okay? Excuse me. Oh my God, it's a divorce. It is thundering outside so bad.